Yesterday, Senator Marco Rubio was asking Victoria Nuland from the Department of State, Biden's Department of State, about Ukraine and about these reports on Russian media. Now, this was propaganda from the Russians. Reports on Russian media that Ukraine was going to stage a bioweapon attack and they were going to act like it was a false flag attack. So the allegation on Russian media, the propaganda, accused the Ukrainians of possibly waging a bioweapons attack, blaming it on the Russians as an excuse or as justification for, drawing NATO and the U.S., drawing the world into this war. Rubio was asking Biden's Department of State about this, and take a listen to this conversation. It's extremely interesting.
Well, I only have a minute left. Let me ask you, does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian troops, Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
I'm sure you're aware that the Russian propaganda groups are already putting out there all kinds of information about how they've uncovered a plot by the Ukrainians to release biological weapons in the country and with NATO's coordination. If there's a biological or chemical weapon incident or attack inside of Ukraine, is there any doubt in your mind that 100% it would be the Russians that would be behind it?
There is no doubt in my mind, Senator, and it is classic Russian technique to blame on the other guy what they're planning to do themselves.
So, first of all, to begin with, anything that you hear on Russian media is obviously propaganda, and it's obviously propaganda with a purpose. I think, however, that a lot of Republicans are missing the point about this Rubio clip. It's obviously gone wildly viral, as it should, because Victoria Nuland didn't just say, no, there aren't bioweapons labs in Ukraine. She danced around it. She, in a sense, acknowledged that they exist. She just tried to paint them as being part of the biodefense efforts of the United States and our partners abroad, which is basically a nuanced way of saying, yes, there are bioweapons labs in Ukraine that the U.S. is involved in. This might remind you of Wuhan, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, because that's exactly the same talking points, the same narrative that the left spun around the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that it wasn't bioweapons research, it was just biodefense. They wanted to understand and anticipate what pathogen might be unleashed on the world. And so they had to juice up the viruses themselves to see which pathogen might naturally evolve and jump from animal to human. I mean, it was just a load of BS. They also use vaccine development as one of their euphemistic talking points. They say, well, in order to develop a vaccine for one of these, we have to understand for one of these viruses, we have to understand how the virus works, which I guess requires them to turn the virus into a bioweapon. Funny how that works. So the most interesting, illustrative part of Victoria Nuland's answer is she didn't just say no. She essentially admitted that bioweapons research happens. She just justified it as, well, it's part of biodefense. We're trying to protect the world. Yeah, that's what Dr. Fauci has always said. That's what the Wuhan Institute of Virology said. That's what Peter Daszak at EcoHealth Alliance, that's what all of these people said, that this is biodefense, not bioweapons. Well, it turns out it's essentially potato. And so I think Republicans are somewhat missing the point here. There can be two things that are true at once. And the first thing that can be true is when Russia accuses the Ukraine of potentially waging a bioweapons attack, that's propaganda, right? It's propaganda. The Russians always do exactly what Victoria Nuland said. They accuse their opposition of doing what they intend to do. So if there is a bioweapons attack in Ukraine, of course it came from the Russians. It's not the Ukrainians. It's not a false flag attack from Zelensky and his people. It is the Russians if they do that. And maybe the Russians are trying to lay the groundwork so that they can wage a biological or chemical weapons attack in Ukraine. So that can be true in and of itself, that the Russian propaganda is propaganda, and that if there is a bioweapons attack in Ukraine, it's obviously from the Russians. That's true. But it's also a separate issue of whether there is bioweapons research happening at laboratories in Ukraine tied somehow, perhaps financially, to the U.S. government. There's no, after Wuhan, why wouldn't we believe that this is true? Why wouldn't we at least ask these questions? Why wouldn't we be skeptical of the narrative coming from the Biden administration? Why wouldn't we doubt what we are being told? Why wouldn't we investigate this?